Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to trace the massive, sprawling history of the United States. But instead of just dryly memorizing dates, we're looking at this through the fascinating lens of a domino effect. Think of it like cause and consequence. Every major event in history is a reaction to something else. And understanding that chain reaction is honestly the absolute best way to grasp how this nation was actually built.
To keep things moving and nicely structured, we've broken this incredibly dense timeline down into 5 key eras. Before the United States, Revolution and Independence, Expansion and Division, the World Wars, and finally, the modern superpower.
So, Section 1, Before the United States. From diverse origins to European colonization. Let's look at the rich history that existed long, long before the nation itself was ever formed.
Long before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic, this was a deeply populated, incredibly diverse continent. People originally crossed the Beringia land bridge way back during the Ice Age, and they evolved into highly advanced cultures. We're talking about the Mississippi culture, building massive raised cities, the Pueblos constructing complex multi-story stone villages out in the Southwest, and the totally fascinating Iroquois Confederacy, which actually formed a centralized, democratic government. But when European explorers began arriving in the late 15th century, it triggered a devastating chain reaction. Now, while there were absolutely cruel and violent conflicts, the most significant factor in the demise of native populations was invisible. The native people just had zero immunity to the foreign diseases brought across the ocean. Tragically, an estimated 90% of the native population was wiped out. It's an incredibly sobering statistic.
So how exactly did cause and effect drive colonization from there? Well, in 1607, the English settled Jamestown and pretty quickly realized that tobacco was a massively lucrative export. But that action created an immediate, urgent need for labor. And the tragic reaction to that need was a heavy reliance on indentured servants, which ultimately led to the horrific expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were forced into brutal, dehumanizing conditions, all to generate immense wealth that flowed straight back to European powers.
Let's move right into Section 2, Revolution and Independence. From taxation to a new nation, we'll see how this exact same economic engine eventually caused those colonies to break away.
You can literally see the action and reaction playing out here. Britain fights the French-Indian War, right? And they rack up huge debt. So, to pay it off, they slap heavy taxes on the American colonies. Sugar, stamps, tea, glass. Well, the colonists erupt. They're furious at being taxed without having a single voice or representation in British Parliament. Those protests rapidly boil over into deadly skirmishes like the Boston Massacre and rebellious acts like the Boston Tea Party, where they just tossed precious cargo straight into the harbor. The fuse was officially lit.
After that, the revolution escalated at breakneck speed. In just a handful of years, we go from delegates meeting up in Philadelphia to discuss taxes to armed militias clashing with British troops at Lexington and Concord. By July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is approved. It's an all-out war now, and crucially, with the military support of French and Spanish allies, the Continental Army eventually forced a British surrender. The 1783 Treaty of Paris made it official. The United States was an independent nation.
But winning a war is really only half the battle. You then have to figure out how to actually run a country. With independence secured, the young nation desperately needed rules of the game. This led directly to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, and then the Bill of Rights to guarantee fundamental freedoms. Fast forward to 1789, the government is officially launched, and George Washington steps up as the very first president.
Now we enter Section 3, Expansion and Division, growing borders and breaking bonds. The young nation starts to grow at an explosive rate. But as we'll see, that rapid expansion creates massive internal fractures.
To really grasp the sheer scale of this early expansion, consider this wild domino effect. Over in Europe, Napoleon desperately needed cash for his impending war with Britain. So President Thomas Jefferson capitalizes on this and buys the massive Louisiana Territory for a mere $15 million. I mean, with the stroke of a pen in 1803, the size of the United States literally doubled. It was the bargain of the century.
As those borders grew, so did a powerful new philosophy known as manifest destiny. This was the widespread belief that the U.S. was quite literally destined to expand its territory across the entire continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This justified incredibly aggressive expansion. It directly caused the Mexican-American War, which added places like California and Texas, but it also resulted in the tragic forced relocation of Native Americans. The most devastating example of this being the Trail of Tears in the 1830s.
Now, what's absolutely essential to understand is that all this new territory forced a huge nation-breaking question. Would these new states be free, or would they allow slavery? The geographic divide was incredibly stark. You have the North, highly industrialized, heavily populated, and made up of free states, and then the South, an agricultural economy fundamentally reliant on slave labor. So when Abraham Lincoln was elected, the South feared he was going to outlaw slavery, triggering South Carolina and others to secede from the Union entirely.
The immediate reaction to that secession was the American Civil War. It was a fully industrialized, unbelievably bloody conflict. And right in the middle of it all, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a monumental executive order granting freedom to over 3 million enslaved individuals in the Confederate States. It completely fundamentally shifted the moral trajectory of the entire nation. The events that played out defined a brutal era. It kicks off with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in 1861, hits a massive turning point at the extremely bloody Battle of Gettysburg, and finally ends with General Robert E. Lee surrendering to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in 1865. In the aftermath, the 13th Amendment officially abolishes slavery, but tragedy strikes immediately with the assassination of President Lincoln. The Union was preserved, but the deep wounds from this era, they'd take decades to even begin to heal.
This brings us to Section 4, the World Wars, stepping onto the global stage. After the Civil War and a period of rapid industrial growth, the US gets abruptly pulled out of its isolationist shell.
And once again, the domino effect is perfectly illustrated. When World War I breaks out in Europe, the US tries hard to stay out of it. They're protected by 2 giant oceans, right? But they just couldn't ignore the provocations forever. A German U-boat sinks the Lusitania, costing American lives. Then, the absolute final straw. The US intercepts a telegram from Germany actively urging Mexico to invade the United States. The reaction was basically inevitable at that point. America declares war and sends troops overseas to help secure an Allied victory.
Coming out of that first global conflict, the US entered this crazy period of wild extremes. The Roaring '20s brought huge cultural shifts. Jazz music, Hollywood booming, the birth of women's rights, all fueled by mass-produced tech like the Ford Model T and the radio. We also saw the era of Prohibition, but this massive high came crashing down. Literally, the Wall Street stock market collapse directly instigated the Great Depression, throwing the country into a grueling era of economic hardship throughout the 1930s. And then just a decade later, the US is pulled into an even larger, more destructive conflict. The devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was the direct catalyst forcing the US into World War II. They fought across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The war ultimately concluded with a terrifying technological leap, the Manhattan Project's creation of the atomic bomb. The US dropped these weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing a Japanese surrender, but at the cost of over 100,000 civilian lives. It forever changed the face of warfare.
The end of World War II directly sets the stage for our 5th and final era, Section 5, the modern superpower. The world was now left deeply, deeply divided.
It was essentially 2 massive titans squaring off. On one side, you've got the United States and its Western allies, driven by a capitalist ideology and protected by the NATO alliance. On the other side, the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc, driven by a communist ideology under the Warsaw Pact. This fundamental clash fueled the Cold War. Decades of intense espionage, proxy wars, and a constant, very tense struggle for global dominance.
So the mid-20th century was defined by this incredible duality. Globally, the Cold War sparked the space race. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik in 1957, and in direct reaction, the US founds NASA, eventually landing humans on the moon with Apollo 11 in 1969. But domestically, back at home, an equally monumental struggle was taking place. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. were leading a massive, non-violent civil rights movement, demanding equality and an end to segregation, perfectly captured in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech.
Moving into the 21st century, the entire trajectory of the nation was altered in a single morning. The tragic events of September 11, 2001 were a horrific shock to the country. The immediate reaction was this incredible global wave of compassion, but it also plunged the United States into a totally new era of global counterterrorism. That defensive posture profoundly shapes the country's foreign policy and military to this very day.
And that brings us to where we stand right now. The United States is undeniably a modern superpower with a massive economy and global reach. But as we've seen throughout this explainer, every single piece of this nation was built on an incredibly complex 15,000-year chain of action and reaction. Success is never without its profound issues, and the nation absolutely continues to reconcile with its complex past. So we leave you with this final thought. Understanding this immense chain of dominoes is crucial. But considering everything you've learned today, how do you think the next domino will fall?